3 straight days of breathing through a balaclava leaves a distinct, coppery taste of dust in the mouth. Perched up in the rafters, glory is the last thing on a sniper's mind. It's entirely eclipsed by the sharp ache in the knees, the bottle of warm piss sitting uncomfortably close, and the relentless fly bumping against the scope's lens. The whispered legends called her a ghost, an untraceable myth woven into the crosshairs. But myths don't bleed, and they absolutely don't panic when the encrypted comms suddenly crackle to life, broadcasting the single name that confirms she's already a dead woman. 72 hours in a hide site smells like ammonia, stale sweat, and pulverized concrete. Gillian shifted her weight. It was a microscopic movement, maybe a quarter of an inch, but it felt like a seismic event in the suffocating stillness of the abandoned apartment. Her hip bone ground against the hard, debris-covered floor. The tactical pad beneath her had flattened completely sometime yesterday afternoon, rendering it useless against the jagged edge of a shattered tile. She didn't adjust it. Adjusting meant movement, and movement meant death. Through the spotting scope, the ruined cityscape of the valley below shimmered in the midday heat. The air was a thick, wavy soup. It distorted the outlines of the burnt-out sedans and the crumbling cinder-block walls of the target compound 1,200 yards away. "Wind's picking up," Parker whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the distant, rhythmic thumping of a loose piece of corrugated tin on a nearby roof. "I see it," Gillian murmured back. She didn't open her mouth fully to speak. The air was too dry, sucking the moisture from her tongue the second it was exposed. 3 to 4 miles an hour, coming from the left, full value. Parker grunted. He was lying 2 feet to her right, his eye glued to the Leupold spotter. The smell of him, 3 days of unwashed tactical gear, adrenaline, and spearmint gum long bereft of flavor, was deeply familiar. He was a good spotter. Didn't talk about his feelings, didn't complain about the MREs that tasted like cardboard, and never flinched. Gillian blinked, letting her right eye rest for a fraction of a second before settling it back behind the ocular lens of her rifle. The heavy barrel of the .338 Lapua Magnum extended through a narrow gap in the wall, perfectly concealed within the deep shadows of the room. A frayed piece of netting hung down to break up the harsh geometry of the muzzle. Being a woman in the teams wasn't the heroic montage the recruiters pushed. It wasn't about standing on a mountaintop looking fierce. It was this. It was having your sports bra fuse to your skin with dried sweat, the chafing rubbing your collarbone raw beneath the plate carrier. It was the constant, low-grade headache from dehydration and the eye strain that felt like someone driving a hot needle into your optic nerve. You didn't feel like a pioneer. You felt like a highly trained janitor, waiting to mop up a mess from a mile away. "You think Intel is completely full of shit this time, or just mostly?" Parker asked, a sudden break in his professional stoicism. "Mostly," Gillian said. Her finger rested flat against the trigger guard. The metal was warm. "They said a white SUV would pull into the courtyard by 0800. It's pushing 1300. Maybe our guy caught a flat." Maybe. She let her mind detach, just a little. Not enough to lose focus on the crosshairs, but enough to manage the physical pain of lying prone on a concrete floor for 3 days. Her lower back was a tight knot of screaming muscle. She needed water. The tube from her hydration bladder was clipped to her shoulder, but drinking meant shifting her head, breaking her cheek weld, breaking the trance. She ignored the thirst. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and oppressive. The only sounds were the fly, still relentlessly orbiting her rifle scope, and the slow, metronomic sound of their own breathing. Gillian focused on the mirage through the scope. The heat waves flowing across the target area were a sniper's best tool for reading the wind. But today they were violent, erratic. The city was baking itself to death. She hated this place. There was no romance in the crumbling architecture, just the sad reality of a place bombed back to the Stone Age, waiting for the next layer of dust to settle. A shadow detached itself from the doorway of the target compound. Gillian's breathing stopped. The fatigue instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline that tasted metallic in the back of her throat. "Movement," she breathed. "Got him!" Parker was instantly dialed in. Front door, single male, unarmed. Gillian adjusted the parallax knob with infinitesimal slowness. The blurry figure sharpened into a young man, maybe 20, carrying a jerry can. "Just a water runner," she said, the adrenaline receding, leaving behind a sick, hollow feeling in her stomach. "Stand down," Parker said. "Keep your eyes on the road." She settled back into the rifle. The disappointment wasn't about missing a shot. It was about the continuation of the wait. Every hour they stayed here, the statistical probability of being compromised ticked upward. They were deep behind hostile lines, unsupported, relying entirely on the assumption that nobody looked up at the blasted windows of this particular residential block. "Something's wrong," Gillian said, 10 minutes later. It wasn't a tactical observation. It was a feeling in her gut, a sudden primal urge to check over her shoulder. The hair on her arms prickled beneath the combat shirt. "Wind dropped?" Parker asked, checking his Kestrel meter. "No, not the wind." She swallowed hard, trying to generate some saliva. "The street. Look at the street." Parker panned his scope. "I'm looking. Nothing." "Exactly. The kids playing near the burned-out husks 2 blocks down. They're gone. The old woman who's been sweeping the same patch of dirt for 3 days. She's gone." Parker went completely still. "Shit. You're right. Total vacancy." The neighborhood had emptied out. The ambient noise of the ruined city, the distant shouts, the occasional revving of a moped engine, had vanished. It was a vacuum. And in this line of work, vacuums were never natural. They were manufactured. "Pack it up?" Parker asked. It was a heavy question. Abandoning a hide site without target engagement meant mission failure. It meant explaining to Brass why they bailed on a multi-million-dollar intelligence operation based on a bad vibe. Gillian's finger tapped a nervous rhythm against the side of the stock. Her training told her to hold. Her instincts told her to run. Before she could make the call, the radio clipped to her vest hissed. It shouldn't have made a sound. The encrypted comms channel was strictly for emergency extraction or priority target updates from the TOC, Tactical Operations Center. And even then, it would be heavily coded. Brevity words, grids. Instead, a burst of static filled the earpiece. Then, a voice. It wasn't the crisp, filtered voice of a radio operator in a climate-controlled bunker in Virginia. It was heavily accented, raw, and terrifyingly clear. "We see you, Stray." Gillian froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs with such violence it actually hurt. Stray. That was her call sign. Classified, buried under layers of clearance. Nobody outside her immediate platoon and command structure knew that name. "Parker," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Did you hear that?" Parker was already pulling away from his scope, his face pale beneath the smears of camouflage paint. "Comms are compromised. Pack the primary. Now. We are burned." The professionalism they had maintained for 72 hours shattered. Gillian didn't smoothly roll out of her shooting position. She scrambled, her boots scraping loudly against the debris. The adrenaline wasn't a cold focus anymore. It was a hot, messy panic. She grabbed the bolt of the .338 and ripped it back, ejecting the live round. She didn't bother catching it. The heavy brass casing hit the floor with a loud, ringing clack that sounded like a church bell in the quiet room. How the hell are they on this frequency? Parker was frantically shoving the spotting scope into his pack, his hands visibly shaking. "Doesn't matter. Move!" Gillian grabbed the heavy rifle, not bothering to collapse the bipod legs. She needed to break down the weapon to fit it in her drag bag, but there was no time. The radio crackled again. "Third floor, north corner window, the woman." They didn't just have her call sign, they had her exact grid, they had her gender. "Incoming!" Parker screamed, diving toward the structural pillar in the center of the room. The world outside the window didn't just explode, it ceased to exist. An RPG struck the exterior wall directly below their window. The concussive wave hit Gillian before the sound did. It felt like being struck in the chest with a baseball bat swung by a machine. All the air was violently expelled from her lungs. She was lifted off her feet and thrown backward, slamming into the plaster wall opposite the window. The noise was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. A thick, choking cloud of pulverized brick, drywall dust and cordite instantly filled the room. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. Her throat clamped shut in a desperate attempt to keep the abrasive dust out of her lungs. She hit the ground hard, the heavy rifle landing awkwardly across her shins. "Get up! Get up! Get up!" Her brain was screaming the command, but her body felt disconnected, heavy and numb. She rolled onto her side, coughing violently. The taste of copper and ash coated her mouth. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched, sustained whine that drowned out everything else. "Parker!" she croaked. Her voice sounded thin, reedy, like a frightened child's. She crawled forward, the dust so thick it was like moving through dirty water. The light streaming in from the newly enlarged hole in the wall cut through the smoke in solid grey beams. "Parker, sound off!" She found him near the pillar. He wasn't moving. Gillian dragged herself to his side, her hands frantically patting down his chest rig, searching for a pulse, a breath, anything. Her fingers came away slick and wet. Through the settling dust, she saw it. A piece of shrapnel, a jagged chunk of rebar from the destroyed wall, had pierced his neck, driving straight through the collar of his vest. There was no dramatic final breath, no muttered last words about his family, just a massive, fatal hemorrhage. He was already gone. Gillian stared at her blood-soaked gloves. The reality of it didn't compute. 10 seconds ago, he was complaining about the wind. Now he was meat. The sheer, ugly abruptness of it broke something in her. She let out a short, pathetic sound, halfway between a sob and a gag. She clamped a hand over her mouth, fighting the sudden, violent urge to vomit. Focus, compartmentalize. She forced the training back into the driver's seat, shoving the horror into a dark box in the back of her mind. If she stayed here to mourn him, she would die next to him. She grabbed the collar of his plate carrier and pulled. He was dead weight, over 200 pounds of muscle and gear. She couldn't drag him out, not under fire. Standard operating procedure dictated you never leave a man behind. Reality dictated that a 140-pound woman couldn't carry a dead man down 3 flights of stairs while being hunted. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It was a useless, empty sentiment. She reached out with a trembling hand, snatched his dog tags, and yanked hard. The chain snapped. She shoved the metal tags into her chest pocket. She turned back to her gear. Her primary rifle, the .338, was partially buried under rubble. The scope was smashed. The housing cracked completely in half. Useless, dead weight. She left it. She unholstered her sidearm, a SIG P320, and drew her secondary weapon, a compact MK-18 carbine slung across her back. She thumbed the selector switch to semi-auto. Her hands were still shaking, her breathing shallow and ragged. She felt entirely exposed. The ghost was visible. Downstairs, a door was kicked open. The heavy thud echoed up the concrete stairwell. Then came the voices. Arabic, fast, aggressive, shouting commands. They were in the building. The stairwell smelled like rotting garbage and old urine, masked now by the sharp tang of explosives. Gillian pressed her back against the peeling paint of the hallway wall, just outside the door to their destroyed hide site. Her heart wasn't just beating, it was fluttering, a chaotic, uncoordinated rhythm that made her lightheaded. She closed her eyes for a second, forcing herself to take a deep breath in through her nose, out through her mouth. It didn't calm her, but it stopped her vision from tunneling. She was alone. The comms were dead. She had ripped the earpiece out and smashed the radio the moment she left Parker's side, assuming they were tracking the signal. No extraction, no quick reaction force coming to rope in from a Black Hawk. She was a single, compromised asset in a hostile urban environment. 3 floors down, out the back alley, disappear into the Warren. It was a simple plan. Executing it felt impossible. She moved to the edge of the stairwell, leading with the muzzle of her MK-18. The stairs wrapped around an open central shaft. She sliced the pie, inching her head around the corner to look down. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the gloom. 2 floors below, she caught the blur of movement. A shadow passing across the landing, the soft scuff of a tactical boot on concrete. They weren't an untrained militia. They were moving with discipline. Gillian pulled back. Her mind raced. If she engaged from above, she gave up the high ground the moment she had to descend. If she waited, they would pin her on the top floor and pound the building with more RPGs until the roof collapsed on her. She had to push through them. She checked her magazine, full. She tapped the forward assist out of pure nervous habit, ensuring the bolt was fully seated. Gillian descended the first flight of stairs, placing her feet at the very edges of the concrete steps, where they were less likely to creak or crumble. She moved fast but fluidly, absorbing the shock of her own weight in her knees. She reached the second-floor landing just as an insurgent stepped into the stairwell from the hallway opposite her. He was young, wearing a mismatched woodland camo jacket and jeans, an AK-47 held at the low ready. He wasn't looking up. He was looking down the hall. The encounter was a brutal, ugly collision of timing. Gillian didn't have time to aim down her sights. It was pure point shooting. She brought the muzzle up as the insurgent snapped his head toward her. His eyes went wide. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. Gillian pulled the trigger twice. The suppressed MK-18 coughed. Fut-fut, a mechanical, metallic sound in the enclosed space. It wasn't a clean, cinematic kill. The first round caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him violently. His finger clamped down on the trigger of his AK-47 in a death grip. The weapon erupted, deafeningly loud in the concrete stairwell. The unsuppressed gunfire was a physical assault on Gillian's ears, sending chips of concrete flying from the ceiling above her head. She flinched hard, dropping to one knee. Panic surged. She fired again, thrice more, aiming for center mass as he fell backward. The rounds tore through his chest. He hit the floor with a wet, heavy thud, his weapon clattering out of his hands and sliding down the next flight of stairs. Gillian stayed frozen on one knee, her weapon trained on the doorway, waiting for his squadmates to swarm out. Nothing. Silence, save for the ringing in her ears and the wet, gurgling sound coming from the man on the floor. She crept forward, keeping her rifle raised. The smell hit her instantly. Copper, voided bowels, and the sharp, acrid stench of cheap gunpowder. The man was staring at the ceiling, his mouth working silently, dark blood bubbling over his lips. Gillian stood over him. She was supposed to be a sniper, clinical, distant, godlike. The reality of close-quarters combat was visceral, intimate, and profoundly sickening. She watched the life leave his eyes, a rapid, ugly fading. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely keep the rifle steady. She stepped over the body, her boot slipping slightly in the pooling blood. She felt a surge of self-disgust at the slick sound it made. "They heard that," she muttered to herself, her voice a ragged whisper. The unsuppressed AK fire had broadcast her exact position to the whole block. She bounded down the final flight of stairs, abandoning stealth for speed. She hit the ground floor lobby, a debris-strewn cavern of broken glass and overturned furniture. Back door, alley. She sprinted across the lobby, her boots crunching loudly on the glass. Every shadow looked like a gunman. Every pile of trash looked like an IED. Paranoia was a cold hand gripping the back of her neck. She hit the heavy metal fire door at the back of the lobby shoulder first. It gave way with a screech of rusted hinges, spilling her out into the blinding sunlight of the alleyway. The heat hit her like a physical blow. The air in the alley was stagnant, smelling of rotting vegetables and diesel exhaust. She scrambled to her feet, hugging the brick wall. She looked left, a dead end blocked by a burned-out delivery truck. She looked right. The alley stretched for 50 yards before T-intersecting with a wider street. From the street, she heard the screech of tires and the slamming of car doors. More shouting. The net was closing. Gillian started running toward the intersection, her lungs burning, her plate carrier feeling like an iron cage crushing her chest. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was just a woman, bleeding from a cut on her forehead she didn't remember getting, running for her life in a city that wanted her dead, and they knew her name. Sunlight felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Running in 60 pounds of gear wasn't a sprint. It was a controlled, agonizing stumble. The alley walls blurred as Gillian pushed her legs to cycle faster, her thighs burning with lactic acid. She reached the end of the brick corridor, just as the screech of worn brake pads signaled the arrival of a vehicle at the T-intersection ahead. She didn't peek around the corner. Peeking got your face taken off by a blind spray of automatic fire. Instead, she threw her back against the sun-baked brick, panting open-mouthed to quiet the sound of her own ragged breathing. Her chest heaved against the rigid ceramic plates of her armor. Doors slammed. Heavy boots hit the pavement. "Check the alley," a voice shouted in Arabic, guttural and loud. Gillian's eyes darted frantically. The delivery truck blocking the other end was too far. The walls on either side were sheer, windowless brick, stretching up 3 stories. There was no fire escape, no doorway, just a narrow, rusted drainage grate at her feet and a small, boarded-up ventilation shaft about 4 feet off the ground to her left. She didn't think. She reacted. She slung the MK-18 tight across her back and grabbed the rotted wooden slats covering the vent. Her gloves, slick with Parker's blood, slipped on the dry wood. She cursed silently, gripping the edges harder, the splinters biting through the fabric into her palms. She braced a boot against the wall and pulled with everything she had. The wood groaned, then gave way with a sharp crack, sending a shower of rust and dead spiders onto her forearms. The boots at the intersection were moving closer. The crunch of gravel beneath their soles was deafening. Gillian shoved her rifle into the dark hole first, then scrambled up, forcing her head and shoulders through the narrow square opening. The edges of the rusted metal frame caught the shoulder straps of her plate carrier. She was stuck. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She kicked her legs wildly, her boots scraping loudly against the exterior brick. Breathe. Shrink. She exhaled entirely, emptying her lungs of every cubic inch of air, collapsing her ribcage. She wrenched her shoulders sideways, ignoring the violent tearing sound of nylon and the sharp scrape of metal gouging a trench across her collarbone. She popped through the opening just as a shadow fell across the mouth of the alley. She tumbled forward into absolute darkness, falling 3 feet and landing hard on a pile of something soft and foul-smelling. She froze instantly, biting down on her lip so hard she tasted copper. Outside, less than 10 feet away, a man stopped. She could hear his labored breathing. She could smell the cheap, sweet tobacco smoke clinging to his clothes. The narrow beam of a flashlight swept over the boarded-up vent, the light filtering weakly through the remaining broken slats. The beam swept back and forth. Gillian lay in the dark, her hand resting on the grip of her holstered cig. She didn't dare draw it. The sound of the Kydex holster giving up the weapon would be enough. She stared at the slivers of daylight, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to since sniper school. The flashlight beam clicked off. The man hawked, spat on the pavement, and turned around. "Nothing," he yelled back to the street. "Check the next block." The footsteps receded. Gillian let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a decade. She rolled off the pile of garbage, her hands instinctively sweeping the immediate area in the pitch black. The floor was concrete, slick with condensation and something unidentifiable. The air was a suffocating cocktail of mold, wet earth, and raw sewage. She had crawled into the basement of whatever structure bordered the alley. She unclipped the small red lens flashlight from her vest and clicked it on. The red light washed over a subterranean nightmare. It was a root cellar, long abandoned, the walls lined with rotting wooden shelves holding shattered glass jars. The floor was a carpet of debris, mostly decaying cardboard and rat droppings. She was safe, temporarily. But the adrenaline crash was coming, and with it, the physical toll of the last 10 minutes. Her knees suddenly felt like they were filled with sand. She staggered to the far corner of the cellar, furthest from the vent, and slid down the cold, damp wall until her rear hit the floor. She closed her eyes. The silence in the basement was absolute, a stark contrast to the deafening chaos of the RPG strike and the stairwell. But inside her head, it was deafening. She kept hearing the wet thud of Parker's body hitting the concrete floor. She kept seeing the bubbles of blood on the young insurgent's lips. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against her temples. "Compartmentalize," she whispered to the empty room. It was the SEAL mantra. Put it in a box. Lock the box. Deal with it when you're back in the wire. But she wasn't going back to the wire. The damp chill of the cellar began to seep through her sweat-soaked combat shirt. Gillian opened her eyes. The red glow of her flashlight cast long, distorted shadows across the ceiling. She needed to assess. She started with her body, running her hands methodically over her limbs, a habit drilled into her during tactical combat casualty care. Legs, intact, though her left knee throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache from the fall. Torso, the ceramic plates had taken a beating, but they were uncracked. Arms, scratched, bruised, but functional. Then she touched her forehead. Her fingers came away sticky. The adrenaline had masked it entirely, but she had a gash above her right eyebrow, likely from a piece of flying plaster when the RPG hit. It was a shallow cut, but head wounds bleed like a stuck pig. The blood had dried into a thick, crusty mask down the right side of her face, cementing her eyelid half shut. She unzipped the IFAK, individual first aid kit, on her belt. The rip of the Velcro sounded like a gunshot in the quiet cellar. She winced, pausing to listen. Nothing but the slow drip of water from a pipe somewhere in the dark. She pulled out a packet of sterile gauze and a small ampule of iodine. She cracked the ampule, the sharp, medicinal smell instantly overpowering the stench of the basement. She poured it directly onto the gauze. "Fuck!" she hissed through her teeth as she pressed the soaked pad to her forehead. The sting was magnificent. It was a pure, white-hot pain that burned away the fog in her brain. She held the pressure, her knuckles white, letting the pain anchor her to reality. She wasn't a ghost. She was a piece of meat trying desperately not to expire in a foreign basement. Once the bleeding slowed, she secured the gauze with a strip of medical tape. It felt tight and uncomfortable, pulling at the skin every time she blinked. Next, the gear. She dropped the magazine from her MK-18, 17 rounds left. She had 2 spare mags on her rig. Her sidearm was fully loaded with 1 spare. No grenades, no radio, no water. The hydration bladder on her back had ruptured when she squeezed through the vent. She could feel the dampness soaking into her lower back now, the precious water pooling uselessly in the fabric of her trousers. Thirst, which had been a low-grade annoyance in the hide site, was now a sharp, demanding presence in the back of her throat. She leaned her head back against the concrete wall and turned off the red flashlight to save the battery. The darkness was total. With the physical triage done, her mind finally, inevitably, turned to the tactical reality. "We see you, Stray," the voice echoed in the blackness. It wasn't the broken English of a local militia fighter, it was calculated. Mocking. How did they know? Gillian's mind began to spin, tracing the lines of intelligence backward. The operation was a black SOF deployment, classified Title 10. The target package was built by a joint intelligence cell in Virginia, fed to her team commander, Hayes, on a secure satellite uplink. Parker and Gillian were the only 2 on the ground. A 2-man reconnaissance and sniper element, inserted by Halo Jump 3 nights ago. They had maintained total radio silence. They used burst transmissions on encrypted frequencies that hopped 1,000 times a second. You don't just tune in to that frequency. You don't just guess a call sign like Stray. Someone had handed them the keys. The realization was a physical weight in her stomach, heavier than the plates on her chest. A leak. Not a sloppy mistake, but a deliberate hemorrhage of classified operational data. Someone in the chain of command, someone sitting in an air-conditioned operations center drinking bad coffee, had traded their grid coordinates and call signs to the enemy. Why? Money? Politics? It didn't matter. The why was irrelevant to a dead man and a hunted woman. Anger, hot and pure, finally burned through the terror. It was a welcome sensation. Terror made you freeze. Anger made you move. She hated Hayes. She hated the intelligence analysts. She hated the entire bloated bureaucracy that treated her and Parker like expendable chess pieces. She sat in the dark for an hour, letting the anger crystallize into a cold, hard focus. She couldn't trust an extraction protocol, even if she found a working radio. If she called for exfil, the same rat who burned her would hand her extraction coordinates to the insurgents. She was going to have to walk out, 80 miles to the friendly border, hostile territory, no support. She reached into her chest pocket and pulled out Parker's dog tags. The small metal rectangles were warm from her body heat. She ran her thumb over the stamped letters in the dark. "I'm getting out of here, buddy," she whispered into the pitch black, "and then I'm going to find the son of a bitch who did this." She turned the red flashlight back on. It was time to move. Sitting still was a death sentence. She needed a way out of this cellar that didn't involve the vent she came in through. She swept the beam across the back wall. Between two sagging wooden shelves, she spotted the faint outline of a heavy wooden door. It was painted the same dark grey as the concrete, meant to blend in. She stood up, her knee screaming in protest, and drew her cig. She kept the flashlight in her left hand, holding it away from her body, the FBI technique meant to draw fire away from center mass if there was a threat in the dark. She crept toward the door, her boots placing themselves with agonizing care to avoid the crunch of debris. She reached the door. The handle was an old iron latch. She placed her hand on it and pressed her ear to the thick wood. Silence. She depressed the latch. It moved smoothly, heavily oiled. That was wrong. In an abandoned building, metal rusts. Hinges squeak. This latch was maintained. Gillian took a step back, her thumb sweeping the safety off the pistol. She pushed the door open with her boot. The door swung inward, revealing a space that was the complete antithesis of the rotting cellar. The beam of her red flashlight hit a tarp draped across the ceiling to catch dust. Below it, the room was remarkably clean. There was a cot pushed against the far wall, covered in a heavy wool blanket. A small camp stove sat on a wooden crate next to a stack of canned food. The air smelled of butane, old sweat, and faintly of instant coffee. Someone was living down here. Gillian stepped into the room, her weapon tracking left, then right. The space was empty. She moved to the wooden crate. A half-empty bottle of purified water sat next to the stove. The sight of it made her mouth water so intensely it physically ached. She grabbed the bottle, twisting the cap off with one hand while keeping the pistol raised with the other. She smelled it first, just plastic and water, then took a small sip. It was warm, tasting vaguely of dust, and it was the best thing she had ever consumed. She allowed herself 3 swallows, forcing herself to stop before she cramped up. She swept the flashlight over the cot. A duffel bag was shoved underneath it. She knelt, keeping her head on a swivel, and pulled the bag out. It was a standard civilian travel bag, covered in dirt. She unzipped it. Clothes, khakis, button-down shirts, not local garb. She dug deeper. A satellite phone, powered off, a thick notebook filled with messy handwriting, and a passport, American. She flipped it open. A white man in his mid-50s, greying hair, tired eyes, David Cole. The occupation listed on his press credentials tucked inside the passport was independent journalist. "Don't touch that." The voice came from the darkness behind her. It was English, accented with a flat, Midwestern American drawl. It was trembling violently. Gillian didn't spin around. Spinning was how you got shot by a nervous man with a twitchy finger. She slowly lowered the flashlight, pointing the beam at the floor, and slowly stood up, keeping her back to the voice. "I'm putting the bag down," she said. Her voice was raspy, destroyed by the dust and dehydration. She kept her tone flat, calm, authoritative. "I am turning around. Do not shoot." She pivoted slowly. Standing in the corner of the room, half concealed by a hanging tarp she hadn't noticed, was David Cole. He looked worse than his passport photo. He was emaciated, his face covered in a ragged, greying beard. He was clutching an old, rusted Makarov pistol in both hands. The muzzle was pointed roughly at her chest, but it was wavering so badly she thought he might drop it. "Who are you?" David demanded, his voice cracking. He looked at her gear, the plate carrier, the MK-18 slung on her back, the blood-soaked gauze on her head. You're American." "I am," Gillian said. She didn't raise her hands. She kept her right hand relaxed near her thigh, inches from the holstered cig. Put the gun down, David." He flinched when she used his name. "How do you know my name? Are you with the embassy? Did they finally send someone?" The desperate hope in his eyes was pathetic. It made Gillian sick to her stomach. She was the absolute last person he wanted to see. She wasn't a rescue party. She was a walking bullseye, bringing a hornet's nest of armed insurgents right to his doorstep. "I'm not with the embassy," she said gently. "I'm passing through, and if you don't put that pistol down, I'm going to have to kill you, which I really don't want to do." David stared at her. The cold, mechanical certainty in her voice seemed to finally penetrate his panic. He looked at the Makarov in his hands like it was a venomous snake he had just woken up holding. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered the weapon and placed it on the small wooden table next to him. Gillian instantly closed the distance. She didn't draw her weapon, but she moved with a sudden, aggressive fluidity that made David stumble backward against the wall. She snatched the Makarov off the table, ejected the magazine, and racked the slide. A single, tarnished 9mm round popped out and hit the floor. She pocketed the magazine and the loose round, tossing the empty pistol onto his cot. "Hey!" David protested, finding a shred of indignation. "I need that for protection. If the people out there find you, that gun is just going to guarantee they shoot you instead of capturing you," Gillian said, stepping back and sweeping her flashlight over his face. He was terrified, exhausted, and running on fumes. "What happened to you?" David asked, his eyes fixing on the bloody gauze on her forehead and the drying blood smeared across her chest rig. "The explosions, the gunfire, that was you?" "Yes, they're tearing the city apart looking for someone," he whispered. "I've been listening to the street level for hours. They have blockades on every intersection." Gillian processed this. It meant her rat maze was boxed in. "How long have you been down here?" she asked. 2 weeks, David said, rubbing his face with shaking hands. "My fixer got killed at a checkpoint. I managed to slip away into the slums. I've been hiding ever since. The battery on my sat phone is dead. I have no way out." He looked at her, his eyes wide and pleading. "But you have a team, right? You guys have extraction plans, helicopters." The contradiction tore at her. The SEAL ethos was pounded into her soul. Protect the innocent, serve with honor. David was an American civilian trapped in a war zone. It was her sworn duty to protect him. But her duty was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. David was a liability. He was loud, untrained, and weak. Moving through a hostile, cordoned-off city was suicidal enough for a trained operator. Taking a panicked journalist with her was an absolute guarantee of death for them both. She looked at him. She saw the fragile hope hanging on her response. She could lie. She could tell him the cavalry was coming, use his supplies to rest, and then abandon him in the night. It was the tactically sound decision, the ruthless decision, the decision a ghost would make. Gillian felt the phantom ache of Parker's dog tags pressing against her chest. "My spotter is dead," Gillian said, her voice dropping all pretense of professional detachment. It was raw, ugly, and honest. "My comms are destroyed. My command structure is compromised. There are no helicopters coming, David. Nobody knows we are here, and the people hunting me know exactly who I am." David's face fell. The hope shattered, replaced by a hollow, profound despair. He sank down onto his cot, burying his face in his hands. "Oh, God," he sobbed quietly. "We're going to die down here." Gillian looked around the small, neat room. She looked at the sat phone in his bag. "Maybe," she said, pulling the dead sat phone from his duffel. "But not today. You have a solar charger for this?" David looked up, wiping his nose. "Yeah, it's in the bag. Takes hours in direct sunlight, though. "We're going to the roof," Gillian said, her mind already shifting gears, building a new operational framework out of duct tape and desperation. "Pack your shit. We leave in 10 minutes. He stared at her, bewildered by the sudden shift in momentum. "I thought you said they have blockades everywhere. If we go up, they'll see us." "They're looking for a ghost," Gillian said, picking up her MK-18 and checking the action. The cynicism in her voice was absolute. "We're going to give them a ghost. Move." Stairs were the enemy. Every upward step required a negotiation with her bruised knee, a sharp spike of pain that radiated up her femur and settled deep in her lower back. Gillian took the lead, her MK-18 pressed tightly into her shoulder, her eye floating just above the red dot sight. Behind her, David sounded like a broken bellows. His breathing was wet, ragged, and terribly loud in the stifling confines of the concrete stairwell. "Quiet," she mouthed, turning back to him. She didn't whisper. Even a whisper carried. She just formed the word with her dry, cracked lips. David nodded frantically, his eyes wide and white in the gloom. He was clutching his duffel bag to his chest like a shield, his knuckles entirely drained of blood. He smelled of sour fear and unwashed clothes, a sharp contrast to the coppery scent of Parker's blood that still clung to Gillian's gloves. They bypassed the first floor. It was a chaotic mess of overturned furniture and bullet-pocked walls. The insurgents had already swept it, leaving behind the acrid stench of cheap tobacco and spent brass. The second floor was worse. It was here she had killed the young fighter. The body was still there, sprawled awkwardly across the landing, a dark, viscous pool radiating from beneath his chest. The smell of voided bowels and rotting meat hung heavy in the stagnant air. David gagged, slapping a hand over his mouth. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the lip of a concrete step. His boot scraped loudly, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to echo endlessly up the open central shaft of the stairwell. Gillian froze. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't look at David. Her eyes were locked onto the landing above them. Clack. It was the distinct sound of a polymer rifle magazine being tapped against a hard surface. Someone was on the third floor. Gillian reached back, grabbing the heavy fabric of David's shirt, and violently yanked him down until he was kneeling on the stairs beside her. She pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes boring into his with a terrifying intensity. Footsteps sounded above them. Slow, deliberate, 2 sets of boots. They were coming down. Gillian's mind raced through a brutal calculus. 2 targets, a narrow choke point. She had the lower angle, which was bad, but she had the element of surprise, which was good. However, engaging meant a firefight. A firefight meant noise, and noise meant the rest of the block would swarm this stairwell in under 90 seconds. She looked left. 10 feet away, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, leading into a second-floor apartment. She tapped David's shoulder and pointed to the door. He shook his head, paralyzed. Gillian didn't have time for bedside manner. She grabbed the collar of his shirt and physically dragged him off the stairs. They scrambled across the landing, her boots slipping slightly in the slick pool of the dead insurgent's blood. The revulsion was a cold knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. She shoved David through the doorway and slipped in right behind him, pulling the door shut just as the shadows of the 2 men fell across the wall of the stairwell above. The apartment was a ruin. The ceiling had partially collapsed, burying a floral sofa under a mountain of lath and plaster. Sunlight stabbed through gaps in the boarded-up windows, illuminating swirling clouds of dust. Gillian pressed David against the wall beside the doorframe. She stepped in front of him, raising her carbine, the muzzle aimed squarely at the center of the wooden door. "Don't breathe," she breathed directly into his ear. The footsteps reached the landing outside. They stopped. Through the thin wood, Gillian heard a low murmur in Arabic. One of the men laughed, a short, ugly sound. Then came a wet thud, followed by the sound of boots shuffling. They were kicking the dead boy on the floor. David started to tremble. It wasn't a subtle shake. It was a violent, full-body shudder. His teeth clicked together audibly. Gillian clamped her left hand hard over his mouth, pinning his head against the peeling wallpaper. Her glove tasted of dried blood and cordite. David flinched, his eyes rolling back in sheer terror. He bit down involuntarily, his teeth sinking into the thick fabric of her glove, grinding against the flesh of her index finger. The pain was sharp, but Gillian didn't pull away. She leaned her weight into him, her gaze never leaving the door. "Walk away," she prayed to a silent, empty sky. "Just walk away." The handle of the door clicked. It depressed downward, a millimeter at a time. The rusted hinges groaned. Gillian took up the slack on her trigger. The metal was slick with her own sweat. She visualized the trajectory, center mass, straight through the cheap wood. She would drop the first one instantly, shift right, and double-tap the second before he could raise his weapon. But then what? The door opened an inch, a sliver of light from the stairwell cut across the floorboards. Suddenly, a loud, static-filled burst of radio chatter erupted from outside. The voice was barking frantic orders. The pressure on the door handle vanished immediately. "Yalla!" one of the men shouted outside. Heavy boots pounded down the stairs towards the ground floor, fading into the ambient noise of the street. Gillian didn't move for 3 full minutes. She counted her heartbeats, letting the adrenaline metabolize, waiting for the trap to spring. When the silence held, she slowly peeled her hand away from David's mouth. He slumped against the wall, gasping for air as if he had been drowning. He looked at her hand. I bit you. I'm sorry," he stammered, tears tracking through the dirt on his cheeks. Gillian inspected her glove. The fabric was torn, a small bead of blood welling up beneath the tear. It was a minor injury, but it throbbed relentlessly. "Forget it," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the empathy he so clearly craved. "Keep moving. We have 3 more floors." The roof access hatch was heavy steel, rusted shut by years of neglect. Gillian had to use the buttstock of her MK-18 as a hammer, pounding the locking mechanism until the sheer noise of it made her teeth ache. When it finally gave way, the heat of the afternoon sun rolled over them like a physical wave. They scrambled out onto the flat, tar-papered roof. It was a frying pan. The black surface absorbed and radiated the midday sun, creating a suffocating microclimate that smelled heavily of melting petroleum and hot gravel. "Set it up," Gillian ordered, pointing toward a low parapet wall on the western edge of the roof that offered a sliver of shade. David fell to his knees, frantically digging into his duffel bag. He pulled out a folding solar panel, no larger than a hardcover book, and connected it to the bulky satellite phone. He angled the panels directly into the blistering sun. "How long?" Gillian asked, kneeling beside the wall, careful to keep her head below the lip of the parapet. "To get enough juice for a call. Maybe 20 minutes, David said, wiping a mixture of sweat and grime from his forehead. "If the battery isn't completely degraded." 20 minutes. In a kinetic urban environment, 20 minutes was an eternity. Gillian shifted her position, peering through a small drainage scupper in the concrete wall. The city sprawled out below them, in a hazy, heat-distorted panorama of ruin. But it wasn't the architecture she was looking at. It was the pattern of life. She used the unmagnified optic on her rifle to scan the major intersections. 2 blocks north, a pair of pickup trucks with heavy machine guns mounted in the beds were parked diagonally across the avenue, completely blocking traffic. Armed men were dragging concertina wire across the gaps. 3 blocks east, a similar scene played out. "They're cordoning the sector," Gillian murmured. "What does that mean?" David asked, his voice tight. "It means they know I'm still inside this grid square. They're sealing it off. No vehicles in or out. Then they'll start doing door-to-door sweeps with overwhelming numbers." She let the rifle rest on the concrete. "They're tightening the noose." "Because of me," David whispered, staring at the solar panel. "If you hadn't stopped in the basement—" "Stop," Gillian cut him off. Her tone was sharp, snapping like a dry twig. "Guilt is a luxury you afford when you're sitting in a bar back home. Right now, it's just a distraction. Watch the charging light. Tell me when it goes green." She turned her attention back to the streets. The physical pain was mounting. The cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but the flesh around it felt hot and tight, a sure sign of incoming infection. Her mouth was entirely devoid of moisture, her tongue feeling like a piece of dry felt. The thirst was becoming a cognitive impairment, making it difficult to hold a single train of thought. She forced herself to think about the leak. "We see you, Stray." Hayes. It had to be Commander Hayes. He was the only one who signed off on the insertion coordinates. He was the one who pushed the intel packet so aggressively, claiming it was a high-value, time-sensitive target. He had marched her and Parker right into an ambush. She squeezed her eyes shut, the anger a hot coal in her chest. She needed a lifeline, but she couldn't call JSOC. She couldn't call the operations center. If Hayes was the rat, pinging the satellite with her coordinates would just give him the exact rooftop to call in an airstrike on. She needed a ghost of her own. "Light screen," David said. His voice pulled her back to the blistering reality of the roof. "It says 5% battery." Gillian scrambled over to him. She snatched the phone, her thumb hovering over the thick rubber keypad. "Dialing the embassy?" David asked hopefully. "No," Gillian said. She punched in a sequence of 14 numbers from memory. It was an international relay, bouncing through 3 different dummy servers before terminating at a prepaid burner phone in a sleepy coastal town in Florida. The line hissed with satellite static, delaying the ringtone. Ring. Ring. "Yeah." The voice on the other end was gravelly, thick with sleep and decades of cheap cigars. Garrison, former CIA paramilitary, the man who had recruited her into the dark world of off-the-books operations before he burned out and retired to a life of fishing and paranoia. "Garrison, it's Jilly." A long pause on the line. The static popped. "Jilly, my terminal says you went dark 48 hours ago. Command declared a catastrophic compromise. You're dead on paper, kid." "I'm not on paper," Gillian said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Parker is KIA. Hide site was compromised. The locals had our grid and my call sign. We were sold out, Garrison, sold out from the top." Another pause. She could hear the faint sound of a lighter flicking, followed by a long exhale. "Hayes," Garrison said. "It wasn't a question. You know? I know the man has a gambling problem and a lot of offshore accounts that just got very fat. CIA internal has been looking at him, but nobody wanted to believe a Tier 1 commander would flip." "Well, believe it," Gillian snarled. "I need an out, Garrison. I'm boxed in Sector 4. Cordon is tight. I have a civilian with me, American journalist, dead weight." Jesus, Jilly, you don't make it easy. You can't trust an official exfil. If I route a bird to you, Hayes will see the flight plan and vector the locals to shoot it down. I know. That's why I'm calling you. I need a blind drop. Give me a smuggler's route, something off the grid, a hole in the fence. Garrison typed rapidly on a keyboard in the background. Okay. Look, the insurgents don't control the industrial park on the eastern edge of the city. It's no man's land, contested territory. There's an old water treatment facility sitting on the river. Grid reference Delta 927. If you can make it there by nightfall, there's a boatman who runs contraband. His name is Tariq. Tell him the blind man sent you. He'll get you downriver past the checkpoints. Delta 927, Gillian repeated, searing the coordinates into her brain. Jilly, getting out of Sector 4 in daylight. It's suicide. I'll figure it out. Thanks, Garrison. Don't thank me yet. You're still breathing dirt. Stay frosty, kid. The line clicked dead. Gillian stared at the phone screen as the battery indicator flashed red, then went entirely black. She tossed the useless plastic brick back to David. Pack it up, she said, standing up, ignoring the screaming protest of her knee. We're leaving. The embassy? David asked, clinging to his delusion. We're going east, to the river. She looked at the heavy cordons blocking their path. But first, we have to knock down a wall. Creating chaos out of thin air was a foundational skill in the teams. You couldn't fight a numerically superior force head-on. You had to blind them, deafen them, and make them look the wrong way. Gillian knelt in the dust of the stairwell just below the roof access hatch. She had emptied David's duffel bag. Spread out before her were the meager tools of their salvation. 3 cans of butane from his camp stove, a half-empty can of aerosol shaving cream he stubbornly carried, a roll of duct tape, and the last fragmentation grenade from her chest rig. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the exhaustion and dehydration. She taped the butane canisters tightly around the body of the fragmentation grenade. It was crude, incredibly dangerous, and entirely unstable, a makeshift thermobaric device. The frag would detonate, rupturing the butane canisters and instantly igniting the expanding cloud of highly flammable gas. It wouldn't just explode, it would create a massive fireball and a concussive shockwave capable of blowing out windows for a block. What is that? David asked, shrinking back against the wall. Our ticket out, Gillian said, tearing a final piece of tape with her teeth. She stood up, holding the heavy, awkward bundle in her right hand. The cordon is tightest to the north. We're going east. But to go east, we need them to look north. We drop this down the central elevator shaft of the building, adjacent to the northern blockade. When it blows, the entire northern perimeter is going to collapse in on it, thinking they've got me cornered. And then we run? We don't run. We move deliberately. If you run, you draw the eye. You stick to my 6 o'clock. You step where I step. And if the shooting starts, you get on the ground and you don't move until I tell you to. Understand? David nodded, swallowing hard. The fear had hollowed him out, leaving behind a compliant, empty shell. Moving across the rooftops was out of the question. The sniper overwatch would spot them instantly. They had to descend back into the nightmare of the building, cross the alleyway into the adjacent structure, and plant the device. The descent was agonizing. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an alarm bell. Gillian led them down to the 2nd floor, navigating the labyrinth of destroyed apartments until they reached a window overlooking the narrow alley, separating them from the target building. The alley was clear. Go, Gillian whispered. They slipped out the window, dropping silently onto the roof of a crushed sedan, before scrambling into the ground floor window of the adjacent building. The smell here was different. charred wood and damp ash. The building had burned recently, the skeletal remains of the architecture casting long, menacing shadows. They reached the open elevator shaft in the center of the lobby. The cables had snapped, leaving a dark, gaping maw that plunged down into the subterranean parking garage. Gillian looked at the explosive bundle in her hand. This was the point of no return. Once the pin was pulled, the ghost was entirely visible. She hooked her finger through the metal ring of the grenade. She looked at David. "Cover your ears, open your mouth, turn away." She pulled the pin. She held the spoon down for a fraction of a second, feeling the terrible, coiled energy within the small metal sphere, then tossed the entire bundle down the dark shaft. "Move!" she hissed, grabbing David by the strap of his bag and dragging him toward the eastern exit. They were 10 steps away when the device detonated. The sound wasn't a boom. It was a physical crack that tore the air apart. The shockwave hit them from behind, a violent, invisible hand that shoved them forward, knocking David entirely off his feet. A massive pillar of orange flame erupted from the elevator shaft, roaring up to the ceiling, instantly sucking the oxygen out of the lobby. The heat was blinding, searing the back of Gillian's neck. Deafening secondary explosions followed as the blast ignited fuel tanks in the parking garage below. The building groaned, a deep, structural scream as concrete cracked and steel buckled. The diversion was massive. It was catastrophic. Alarms began to shriek across the city. Distant shouts erupted. The staccato pop of confused, undirected automatic gunfire echoed through the streets. Gillian hauled David to his feet. His pants were torn at the knee. Skin scraped raw, but he was moving. They hit the eastern alleyway just as a truckload of insurgents tore past the intersection, heading entirely in the opposite direction toward the towering plume of black smoke. The plan had worked. The cordon had broken to react to the massive explosion. "Keep moving," Gillian ordered, her voice a harsh croak over the ringing in her ears. The next 2 hours were a blur of adrenaline, pain, and shadows. They moved through the shattered remnants of the city, utilizing sewers, burned-out storefronts, and choked alleyways. They didn't speak. They didn't rest. Gillian operated entirely on muscle memory and the cold, burning desire to survive. She navigated the urban terrain like a feral animal, her eyes constantly scanning, her weapon always leading the way. David stumbled often, his civilian shoes failing him on the treacherous rubble. But he didn't complain. The explosion had terrified him into total submission. As the sun began to dip below the jagged skyline, painting the smog-choked sky in bruised shades of purple and red, the dense urban sprawl finally began to give way. The concrete canyon widened, revealing the rusted, skeletal structures of the industrial park. Beyond it, shimmering like a mirage, was the wide, slow-moving expanse of the river. Gillian stopped behind the rusted husk of a shipping container. She leaned heavily against the corrugated metal, her chest heaving. The physical toll finally caught up with her all at once. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her left knee felt like it was packed with broken glass. She unzipped a pouch on her vest and pulled out Parker's dog tags. The metal was sticky with dried blood. She wrapped the chain tightly around her fist, the sharp edges of the tags biting into her palm. They had made it out of the net. They had survived the burn. She looked at David, who was collapsed in the dirt, weeping silently from sheer exhaustion. She didn't feel pity. She didn't feel heroic. She just felt tired, cynical, and dangerously angry. She looked back towards the burning city. The ghost sniper was dead. Parker was dead. The woman standing in the dirt was something else entirely. "Come on," Gillian said, her voice hard as flint, pushing off the shipping container. We have a boat to catch, and then I have a commander to kill. If this gritty dive into the brutal realities of urban survival, betrayal, and the heavy toll of combat kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share the story with your friends. Gillian's journey from a hunted ghost to a survivor, demanding vengeance, proves that sometimes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't a rifle, but the will to survive. Want to see where her hunt for Commander Hayes takes her next? Smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next explosive chapter of the story.